He told himself he didn't need the dogs. He told himself that every morning for 11 days, standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee that had gone cold before he remembered to drink it, watching the tree line at the edge of his property where the spruce grew thick, and the snow piled up on the lower branches until they bowed nearly to the ground. He told himself he didn't need them, and then he turned away from the window, and he went about his day, and the house was very quiet. The house had always been quiet. That was why Reginald Holt had bought it, 14 acres outside of Cochrane, Alberta. A long gravel driveway that discouraged visitors, a wood-burning stove he'd learned to manage in his first winter here, burning through nearly 2 cords between November and April. No neighbors within sight. A creek that ran behind the property and froze solid by December. He had chosen this place the way a man chooses a room to recover in, carefully, deliberately, with the specific intention of being left alone. He had been a Navy SEAL for 22 years. He had served in places whose names he didn't say aloud anymore. He had come back from those places carrying things that didn't show up on any scan or assessment, things that lived behind his eyes and surfaced at 3 in the morning when a sound outside the window was briefly, terribly, something else. He was 54 years old. He had a knee that ached in cold weather, and a scar along his left forearm that turned white in winter, and a particular way of sitting in any room with his back to the wall and a clear line to the door. His wife Carolyn, the real Carolyn, the one who had held him through the worst of the nights and made coffee before he was awake, and laughed at things he said that weren't meant to be funny, had died 3 years ago February. An aneurysm. She was there in the morning and she was gone by noon, and Reginald had stood in a hospital hallway and felt the floor shift beneath him in a way that no training had ever prepared him for. He had sold their house in Calgary 8 months later. He had bought the 14 acres. He had stopped answering most of his phone calls. He was not, he understood, doing especially well, but he was doing. That was the word he used when his daughter called from Vancouver and asked how he was. Doing. The word that meant I am still here, I am still upright, do not ask me anything more specific than that. The dogs arrived on a Tuesday. He didn't know that yet. On Tuesday morning, he drove his truck into Cochrane for groceries, took the long route home because the roads were clear and he wasn't in any hurry, and when he turned up his driveway, he saw the tracks in the snow before he saw anything else. Animal tracks. More than one set. Coming from the direction of the creek. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running. The tracks led to his front porch. He got out. The cold hit him the way Alberta cold always did in March. Not the dramatic cold of midwinter, but the persistent, grinding cold that made you think spring was coming, and then reminded you it wasn't. Not yet. Not for a while. He walked around to the front of the house and stopped. There were 3 of them huddled against the base of his door. German shepherds. Puppies. Young, maybe 8 weeks, maybe 10. 2 of them were curled together in a way that made it difficult to tell where one ended and the other began, a tangle of tan and black fur and small tucked noses. The third sat apart from the others, watching him. This one was darker, almost entirely black, with a stripe of rust along each eyebrow that made it look permanently suspicious. Reginald stood in the cold and looked at them. They looked back. He said, "No." The 2 sleeping ones didn't stir. The dark one blinked at him. He said, "I don't know where you came from, but this isn't." He stopped. He was arguing with a puppy. He was 54 years old, he had extracted men from live combat zones, and he was standing on his own front porch in the Alberta cold arguing with a 10-week-old dog. He closed his mouth. He went inside. He left the door shut. He thought about them while he put the groceries away. He told himself he wasn't thinking about them. He put the canned goods in the cupboard and the bread on the counter and the milk in the refrigerator. And he did not think about the fact that the temperature was supposed to drop to -18 that night, because that was not his problem. Dogs found their way. They had survived this far. They would move on. He sat down with his cold coffee and opened the book he'd been reading for 3 weeks without getting past page 40, and he read the same paragraph 4 times, without taking any of it in. At 4 o'clock, he went back to the door. They were still there. The 2 smaller ones were awake now, pressing against each other for warmth. The dark one had moved. It was sitting directly in front of the door, as though it had been waiting specifically for him to come back. When he opened the door, it looked up at him with an expression that contained, as far as Reginald could tell, absolutely no uncertainty at all. It was not asking, it had simply decided. He looked past it at the property line. At the tree line, he looked for a mother. He found no signs of one. "Fine," he said. He did not say it warmly. He said it the way he might have signed a form he didn't agree with, because the alternative was worse, and he was aware of that, and he resented being aware of it. He went to get the laundry basket. He lined the basket with an old wool blanket, one of Carolyn's, the gray one she'd bought at a market in Canmore the year before she died, the one he hadn't been able to get rid of, and he set all 3 puppies inside it near the wood stove. He heated up some water and found an old medicine dropper and fed them what he could. They were hungry in a way that was painful to witness, each of them going at the dropper with a desperation that was too large for their small bodies. The dark one, after eating, climbed out of the basket and put its front paws on his knee. Reginald looked down at it. The puppy looked up at him. "Don't," he said. The puppy put its chin on his knee. He left it there. He told himself he was just waiting to see what it would do next. He held very still, the way he had once learned to hold still in situations where moving was the thing that got you killed, and he waited, and the puppy's chin on his knee was warm and small and weighed approximately nothing. And outside the window the temperature was dropping and the snow had started again and the light was going out of the sky the way it did in Alberta in March, all at once, with no warning. He did not pick the puppy up. He also did not move his knee. He named them on the 3rd day, because by the 3rd day he had noticed enough about each of them to understand that calling them the puppies was becoming inadequate. The dark one, the one with the rust eyebrows and the complete absence of self-doubt, he named Sergeant. This was not a tender name. It was an accurate name. Sergeant had opinions about everything, about the placement of the food bowl, about the location of the blanket, about what time in the morning constituted a reasonable hour for Reginald to be awake. Sergeant's opinion on that last matter was approximately 5:15, a position it communicated by climbing onto Reginald's chest and pressing its cold nose against his jaw. The first morning this happened, Reginald said a word he hadn't said in some time. The second morning, he was already half awake before Sergeant reached him, because some part of him had apparently adjusted to the expectation. He did not examine that too carefully. The second puppy, tan, with a broad face and a tail that wagged so hard it sometimes threw off its balance. He named Fletcher. Fletcher was profoundly optimistic about everything. Fletcher believed, with the wholehearted conviction of a creature who had not yet been disillusioned, that every person and every object and every moment was an opportunity for joy. Fletcher had already knocked over a full mug of coffee, chewed through one bootlace, and discovered the lower shelf of the bookcase. Reginald had found it sitting in the middle of the living room floor one afternoon, surrounded by 3 paperbacks, apparently very pleased with itself. "Those are not toys," Reginald said. Fletcher wagged. The third puppy, the smallest, a pale gold with one ear that stood up properly and one that flopped and seemed disinclined to correct itself, he named Ghost. Ghost was quieter than the other 2. Ghost watched things. It had a habit of sitting very still in a doorway, half in and half out of a room, observing the proceedings with calm gray eyes. Ghost had, in the 3 days since their arrival, figured out how to open the lower cabinet in the kitchen, locate the one spot near the wood stove that was warmest without being too warm, and communicate a nuanced range of emotional states exclusively through the angle of its functional ear. Ghost reminded him, in ways he didn't want to examine, of the best operators he'd ever worked alongside, the ones who didn't need to be loud. On the 5th night, he dreamed about his wife. This was not unusual. He had been dreaming about Carolyn for 3 years, sometimes good dreams, the kind where she was simply there and nothing was wrong and he woke up reaching for her in the dark, and sometimes the other kind. This was a good dream. She was in the kitchen of their Calgary house, the one with the yellow walls she'd insisted on and he'd complained about until he loved them. And she was laughing at something he'd said. And the light was that particular afternoon light that only happened in summer, and he could smell coffee. He woke up at 4 in the morning to find Sergeant pressed against his side and Fletcher sprawled across his feet, and Ghost curled in an impossible-looking spiral near his shoulder. The room was dark. The stove had burned down, but the house was still warm. Outside, the wind had come up and was working at the corners of the old house the way it always did. That low, sustained sound that he'd learned in his first winter here meant nothing, just the house talking back to the cold. He lay still for a while. The dogs breathed. He had not slept through the night, not completely, not without waking, in longer than he could comfortably account for, but he had slept, and the dream had been a good one, and the room was warm. And he thought about Carolyn standing in the kitchen with that particular light on her, and the specific way she laughed when he said something that surprised her, head tilted back slightly, like she needed more room for the sound. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, and he did not then, but he breathed, and that felt, on that particular night, like something. The week that followed was not without its complications. Sargent discovered the stairs and developed an immediate and passionate interest in Reginald's bedroom, specifically in the box under the bed that contained, among other things, a framed photograph that Reginald had put there because having it on the dresser was too much on certain days. He came upstairs one afternoon to find Sargent sitting on top of the box, looking extremely satisfied with this development. "Get down," Reginald said. Sargent looked at him, got down, got back up. He left the box where it was but moved the photograph to the dresser. He stood in front of it for a minute, Carolyn at their daughter's wedding 8 years ago, wearing the green dress she'd bought, specifically, because he'd said he liked her in green. She was looking at something off to the side of the camera, and she was almost smiling, and he knew, because he knew her, that she was about to say something and was deciding whether it was too much. Usually it wasn't. Usually what she said was exactly right. He touched the corner of the frame. Sargent pressed its nose against his calf. "Yeah," he said, to no one in particular. "I know." Fletcher committed what Reginald later came to think of as the Great Boot incident on a Wednesday morning. Reginald had been going out to the woodpile and had set his work boots by the door. When he came back inside, one boot was where he had left it. The other was in the living room, missing its lace entirely. Fletcher was also in the living room, positioned approximately 3 feet from the boot, with the particular posture of an animal that has not done anything and is baffled by the implication that it might have. "Fletcher," Reginald said. Fletcher's tail moved cautiously. Reginald looked at the boot. He looked at Fletcher. He looked around the room. The lace was not immediately visible. He eventually found it behind the couch, chewed into 4 unequal pieces with what appeared to be considerable enthusiasm. He stood there for a moment, looking at the pieces of the bootlace, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed. It was a short laugh. It was rusty, the laugh of a mechanism that hadn't been run in a while, finding its way back through the gears. But it was real, and it surprised him, and Fletcher, hearing it, apparently decided this was an invitation and launched itself across the room and onto his feet with a force wildly disproportionate to its size. He reached down without thinking and scratched behind its ears. Fletcher's whole body moved with the tail. He called his daughter that Friday. This was notable because for the past several months the calls had gone the other way. Simone calling him, working through the specific calibration of concern that adult children develop for a grieving parent, asking questions that were really questions about other questions. He had not called her unprompted since Christmas. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, I have dogs," he said, a pause. "You what, 3 of them? German shepherd puppies. They showed up on the porch. I don't know where they came from." He paused. "They seem to be staying." Another pause, longer. He could hear her breathing, the particular rhythm of his daughter, trying to figure out how to respond to information she hadn't expected. Are you okay with that?" He looked across the kitchen. Sargent was in the doorway. Ghost was somewhere behind him, invisible, which meant Ghost was watching. Fletcher was most likely doing something inadvisable in another room. "I think so," he said. "Dad," Simone said, and her voice had shifted into something he recognized. Not the careful, measured concern, but something older and less composed. I'm really glad." "Don't make a thing of it," he said. "I'm not," she said. "I'm really not." But she stayed on the phone for 45 minutes, which was longer than they'd talked in months, and somewhere around the 30-minute mark he told her about Fletcher and the bootless, and found himself laughing again when he did, and heard her laugh with him, and the sound of her laugh was something he had been missing, and hadn't let himself know it until just then. He found the mother on a Saturday. He had been walking the property. Something he'd started doing in the past week, a thing he hadn't done much of through the winter, following the creek line east to where the land dipped, and then rose again toward the spruce. He had started the walks because the dogs needed space and motion, and he had discovered that outside, with cold air in his lungs, and the dogs moving through the snow ahead of him, he felt something approximate to ease. Not peace, exactly. He had not had peace in so long that he wasn't sure he'd recognize it, but a version of presence that he could manage. The three of them ranged ahead of him, Sergeant purposeful and fast, Fletcher investigating everything, Ghost moving in that quiet, considered way. He had started to read them the way he'd once read terrain. Where Sergeant went, there was something worth noting. Where Ghost paused, there was something worth understanding. He found the mother where the creek bent east, in a hollow between two fallen spruce. It was clear she had been gone for some time. The cold had done its work. She was a large dog, mostly black with the tan markings of the breed, and she was still in the position of something that had lain down to rest, curled slightly, and he understood that she had done what she could for as long as she could, and then she hadn't been able to do anything more. He stood there for a while. Sergeant came and stood next to him, did not make a sound, just stood there, present in the way that dogs are present, without qualification, without commentary, without asking for anything in return. "Good dog," he said quietly. "All three of you. Good dogs." He went back to the house and got the shovel, and came back and did what needed to be done, there in the bend of the creek under the spruce, while the three of them sat in the snow and watched. He said nothing while he worked. The ground was hard. It took the better part of an hour. When he was done, Ghost came forward and stood at the edge of what he had done, and looked, and then came to him and pressed its head against his leg. He put his hand on top of Ghost's head and held it there. He had buried people before. Men he had served with. Men he had not been able to bring back. He had stood in the cold in countries very far from this one, and felt the specific weight of loss, the way it settled in the chest and changed the gravity of everything. He was not naive about grief. He had lived in it for 3 years, but there was something about this small, uncomplicated act of service, this thing he could do, this hole he could dig, this acknowledgement he could make, that reached somewhere that grief had made unreachable. He did not know what to do with that. He walked home and he thought about it. The night the creek froze hard enough to skate on. He was not skating, he was walking across it, checking the ice for the dogs. Ghost caught a scent at the far bank and went still in the way that meant something real, not curiosity but alert, and Reginald's old instincts came up without being called. He crossed to where Ghost stood. 20 feet into the tree line, in a depression in the snow, there was a dog, not a puppy, an adult, a male, large, visibly underfed, with a wound on his right front leg that had frozen over but needed attention. He was alive. He watched Reginald approach without moving, without growling, with the flat, exhausted look of an animal that has burned through its options. Reginald crouched down, held out his hand, waited. The dog looked at his hand for a long time. Then it put its nose to his palm. He brought it back to the house. Carried it the last part, because the leg wouldn't hold, and he cleaned the wound with the kit he kept for his own injuries, and wrapped it properly, and set the dog near the stove with water. He warmed first because the cold had gone deep. The 3 puppies came to investigate in their different ways. Sergeant with authority, Fletcher with excessive enthusiasm, Ghost with the careful approach of someone gathering information before committing to an opinion. The adult dog, he was a shepherd too, or mostly, with something heavier mixed in, a big-boned solidity that Sergeant already seemed to regard with enormous respect, didn't startle at the puppies. He let them come. He was too tired for anything but that, and then he slept. And Reginald sat across the room and watched him breathe, and thought that sometimes the things you don't plan for are the things that matter most. He didn't have a name for the adult dog that night. By morning he did. Tanner, because of the color of his coat in the firelight, and because it suited him, and because Reginald had woken up at 6 in the morning with the name already in his head, as though it had been waiting there. His daughter came up from Vancouver in April. She had offered twice before, and he had redirected both times. Not refused exactly, but found reasons that weren't quite reasons. When she offered again in March, he said yes, and she was quiet for a moment in a way that told him she hadn't expected that, and then she said she'd drive up on the Thursday. She arrived in the late afternoon, when the light was still good, and the snow had softened enough that the driveway was negotiable. He heard her car on the gravel and went out to meet her. She got out of the car, and she looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since her mother died. With that combination of love and assessment that he didn't blame her for, because he understood it. Then the door burst open behind him, and Fletcher came out like something launched from a cannon, hit the snow at full speed, recovered, and launched itself at Simone's knees. She went down laughing, just dropped into the snow with her coat still on, laughing, with Fletcher on her chest trying to reach her face. Sargent came out behind Fletcher with considerably more dignity and stood nearby assessing the situation. Ghost came last, walked to Simone, and sat down beside her with the calm certainty of an animal that has decided someone is trustworthy and sees no need to perform about it. Reginald stood on the porch and watched his daughter, lying in the snow laughing at 3 dogs, and something in his chest did something that he could not have named precisely, but that felt, after 3 years of contraction, like a small expansion. Tanner stood next to him on the porch, leaning slightly against his leg, looking out at the property with the settled authority of a dog who has decided where he belongs. "You didn't tell me there were 4 of them," Simone said, still in the snow. "The 4th one arrived later," Reginald said. She looked up at him. Fletcher was sitting on her stomach. "Dad," she said. "You look good," he said. "Come inside, I made soup." She got up out of the snow, with Fletcher still attached to her coat sleeve, and she came up the steps and she stopped next to him and looked at his face for a moment, and then she put her arms around him in the way that Carolyn used to do. Not the careful hug of someone managing a fragile person, but the real kind, the kind that doesn't ask permission. He held on. Outside, the creek was running again. He could hear it from the porch. That sound of moving water that meant the ice had finally let go, that meant the ground was loosening, that meant something he hadn't let himself think about in a long time, that the season does, in fact, change. Inside, the stove was going. The soup was on. 4 dogs were doing what 4 dogs do in a house that has learned to hold them. He had told himself he didn't need them. He had been wrong about that, and he was glad.